Good evening. I'm Renee Lane, the Executive Director of the Airborne and Special Operations Museum Foundation. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and supporting the Foundation for our Distinguished Speaker Series event. Our special guest tonight is Colonel Keith Nightingale, author of Phoenix Rising, and our moderator this evening is Stephen Cage, Command Historian for the Joint Special Operations Command. My thanks to both of you this evening. I'd like to thank our Foundation staff and our museum team for making this presentation possible. A special thanks to Jim Bartlinski for helping coordinate, and to Abby Cashel, who's working behind the scenes to make this webinar work. So thank you. Bear with us with some of the technical difficulties. This is our first one. So thank you all very much. Steve, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Renee. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. So thanks to you, the ASOMF Foundation, as well as the Airborne Special Operations Museum itself for sponsoring this event, and to Colonel Keith Nightingale, A, for writing this book, and for B, agreeing to be here tonight to discuss the story with you. What we'll be doing initially is just going over some questions. Colonel Nightingale will have a chance to discuss his book, and then about the last 20 minutes or so, there'll be the opportunity for questions from the participating audience. So if there's something that I don't ask or we don't otherwise discuss in that first 40 minutes, you can feel free to jump in for the last 20 or so and ask the questions of Colonel Nightingale. We may also, I think, have kind of a special guest here. Colonel Rod Lenahan was the J2 for Joint Task Force 179, which was the task force established to execute the rescue mission of the hostages in Iran. And assuming he is connected, there may be some J intelligence questions that go his way. But as we get back to Colonel Keith Nightingale, you can see him there. He's got his book kind of on the right side as you look at the screen. So that's something you'll be getting if you haven't picked it up already. Well, let's go ahead and start. Colonel Keith Nightingale, native Californian, attended high school in Vermont and then attended Claremont College, graduating in 1965 with a Bachelor of Science degree and a commission as an infantry officer. Keith, of course, you know, Vietnam was really starting to gin up around that time. You had a variety of other career options, I think. What led you to decide to go into the Army and ultimately make it a career?
Well, every male in my family, literally since the Pilgrims, has been in the Army. And so it was preordained that I was going to go in, not necessarily for a career, but certainly as the beginning. I grew up as an Army brat. My grandfather was in France. My great-great-grandfather was in the Civil War, all the way back to the Revolution, etc. So anyway, I signed up for ROTC as the normal thing that you did. Was completely expected by the family. I had been very interested in history from the time I was a small boy. So it's naturally gravitated along with my Army brat experience. I decided that I was going to go infantry, and then the handwriting was on the wall that we were going to be in Vietnam, 1964, 65. I was married my senior year in college, so I began to think about, well, what are the odds of going to Vietnam and surviving? And it was clear to me that if I was going to go to Vietnam, I better go with the best that I could. So I decided to sign up for both Airborne and for Ranger, and asked for the 82nd. Because I chose to go regular Army infantry, I got all of those. And then I joined, went to Fort Benning, went through all the normal wickets, went to school, went to the 82nd, and then was assigned to the MATA course in Vietnam, for Vietnam. Was an advisor. When I landed on the airplane, I was an advisor to the Airborne Brigade. And then about 24 hours later, after a couple of Ranger battalions had been wiped out, I was reassigned to the Rangers, 52nd Rangers to be specific. Went there, through deputy advisor, senior advisor, TET 68, came home in May, a month after I was supposed to, and was assigned to ROTC Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. There I had to make a decision. Do I go to the advanced course or do I resign at that point? I decided to join the Army, if you would, and went to the advanced course and spent the rest of the 30 years in the Army.
Okay, well, that was obviously a pretty good chunk of time, and not unusually, yet you kind of briefly went through it, but with that initial assignment in the 82nd, you started as platoon leader, then a company commander, and then a S3 or operations air officer before going to Vietnam. So less than 2 years after commissioning, having done those 3 jobs, not unusual for members of that era of persistent conflict a little bit earlier than today, that you found yourself that Vietnam Ranger Battalion advisor. What did you take away from serving with, that was turned out to be your first Ranger unit, not your last. What did you take away from that outfit?
I would go back a little bit and say my time in the 82nd before I went was hugely educational. The senior officers and all the senior NCOs were World War II Korea War vets, and they were extremely professional and went out of their way to train Second Lieutenant Nightingale on how to be an officer. Purely by attrition, I ended up being a company commander. Well, I'm Second Lieutenant Nightingale, company commander, C Company 2505. I got 4 platoon sergeants who'd been in World War II in Korea, you know, and a first sergeant who was equally with the program. All of them had 2, 3, 4 jump stars. I mean, I'm in charge of these guys and they're sort of managing me, very educational. I end up in Vietnam with the 52nd. One of the best professional experiences I had. Unfortunately, we were almost wiped out on the 24th of June, 1967. As one of my very first combat experiences in War Zone D, we went from 450 troops to 32 in the perimeter 12 hours later. And the thing that held us together was the professionalism of those Vietnamese, and most importantly, the battalion commander, Win Hep. And then over the course of several months, the senior advisor, Al Shine, left. I became the senior advisor and was with them through TET in 1968. And Hep was constantly training me, teaching me, advising me on what to do. And he was very blunt about it. He said, "You're going to come back and command American troops. I want you to do the best job possible. And this is how you should do it." And it was an incredible learning experience. That and the time that I had as a battalion commander in 82nd with Lindsay and Steiner were probably the 2 most professionally valuable experiences that I had.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and tremendous examples. Now, you mentioned earlier that after you returned to Vietnam, went to the career course, you found yourself in the 101st Airborne Division, redeployed back to Vietnam, this time as a company commander, as a G2 staff officer on the division staff later on, returning to Fort Campbell with the 173rd Brigade at that time, which formed the basis of the 101st Airborne Division's 3rd Brigade. Then you went off to, after some jobs there, you went off to be a plank holder, an original member of the 1st Ranger Battalion. So that was kind of your 2nd Ranger unit that you got to serve with. What brought you into that unit that you would spend more time in later on?
Well, actually, it was a matter of both pride and pay. We knew that the 3rd Brigade of the 101st was coming off a jump status. They were going just air assault, no jump pay, which was, in my mind, was sort of one of the thrills of being in the Army. Same time, the Army announced the creation of the 1st Ranger Battalion, and the commander was going to be Lieutenant Colonel Casey Lure. Colonel Luer was a battalion commander when I was in the 101st in Vietnam, and we knew each other. I transitioned the Da Nang ASP from my company to his battalion, so I spent a week with him. We got to know each other quite well. And I applied for the Ranger Battalion. And the mil percent guy laughed at me and said, "There's no way, you spent your entire time in units, you know, you've got to spend some staff time." And so I then called Colonel Luer and I said, "This guy just told me I can't join you." And he said, "Okay, don't do anything, stay home, we'll talk to you later." 24 hours later, I get this choked phone call telling me I have now been assigned to the 1st Ranger Battalion and show up at Fort Benning. Which I did, and another huge educational experience. I mean, we collected the best NCOs that the Army had at the time and the most motivated officers, and basically invented the modern day Ranger Battalion. But the things that were proliferated to the Army were the important stuff: task conditions and standards, the difference between being an officer and being an NCO. Live fire exercises is the basis of things, of good, solid training and organizations. So, you know, it was just, again, serendipity. Life is luck and timing. And, you know, I got lucky as time went on up to that point.
It's a great point. Now, continuing on, you left the Rangers, went off to Fort Leavenworth for the Command and General Staff College. Departed there for Italy, where you served successively as the Battalion XO Deputy Commander and Commander of the 1st of the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Ended up with the serving in the G3 operations at the U.S. Army Southern European Task Force. And then you came back to Washington, D.C. to serve as the Africa Middle East Desk Officer in 1979 of the Operations Directorate of the Army Staff. And that's where the book really starts. Before we go any further, just a little bit of background to make sure everybody's kind of tracking. I know that we have some old soldiers or other, you know, veterans in the audience who are kind of familiar with, or people who may wear glasses because of age than other reasons. But just to give a little bit of background, 2 things I want to mention is we left Vietnam, essentially as we abandoned Vietnam in 1975. Most of the troop units had been gone a year or so before that. The United States military did what the United States military has done a lot in its past after war: demobilized substantially. And during that time frame, we lost a lot of capability. As Vietnam was cranking up, President Kennedy had been a big proponent for what later became known as low-intensity conflict. The insurgencies, working with nations like Vietnam for security assistance and trying to help them develop, he saw the need for elements such as special forces, which greatly expanded during Vietnam. The SEALs, Sea, Air, and Land Forces of the Navy, was established during that time and provided vital services in Vietnam. Air Force Special Operations, the establishment of the gunships. Keith alluded earlier to the AC-130. Well, there's, you know, other things out there. The started with the AC-47, then the 119, but that whole process started, as well as other vital uses of Air Force Special Operations. After the war ended, active duty Special Forces groups were cut in half. The SEALs only stayed because the Chief of Naval Operations decided not to defer to his Atlantic and Pacific Fleet commanders and let them go. So they held on. Air Force Special Operations, so many of their platforms disappeared and were downsized, as was the size of the Air Force Special Operations element. Probably the only bright spot was what Keith mentioned, the establishment of those 2 Ranger battalions, the 1st and 2nd. Though we were probably the only units activated during this time frame, both in 1974. And we'll come back to them. But that's kind of what we were looking at. There was no senior soft sponsor. And even as the conventional Army was disbanded, nobody was really watching out for special forces types units. Second thing I wanted to mention was really the expansion and building of terrorism. That had really been kind of kicking around. There's probably always been terrorists, but it really started late 60s and moving into the early 70s, where you had elements doing targeted assassinations, bombings, hostage taking, kidnappings for ransom, and other terrorist activities. A lot of our partner nations had established capabilities already to deal with it. Israel, surrounded by a lot of countries since its inception that hated it, established capability to take back hostages and react to offensive actions. The British repurposed a World War II Special Operations Unit, the Special Air Service, and that was used by them. The French established a unit. The Germans established Grundschutzgruppe 9 after the '72 Olympics, when Israeli athletes were killed in München during the Olympics. And so there was a lot of capability out there, but the United States didn't really have that. An officer who had served a tour with the Special Air Service earlier, a guy named Charlie Beckwith, came back and was a proponent for establishing a similar type unit in the United States, but that didn't really grab any traction until 1975, when he got some general officer interest. And ultimately, a 4-star commander for Readiness Command initiated a note to, or a request or a recommendation to the Joint Staff and the Chief of Staff Army that we ought to have some sort of force like that. That rested without action for about a year until the Israeli rescue mission at Entebbe during America's bicentennial weekend of July '76. After that, the process started under this Colonel Beckwith to establish a unit that could rescue hostages and perform other acts going against terrorism. So that's kind of a little bit of background there just to get going. So Colonel Nightingale, then Major Nightingale, was in the Operations Directorate of the Army Staff. He found himself working this desk. The hostages were seized on 4 November 1979. He found out about it. And then, Keith, you were working for Major General Jim Vaught, the director of your section. If you could talk a little bit about him, working for him initially, and then why you thought he was selected as the commander of Task Force 179.
I was assigned to what was called DAMO-OD, Department of the Army Military Ops, Operations Directorate. And this was in the basement of the Pentagon. General Vaught, Major General Vaught, was the director, and it was broken up into various regional desks and, sync specific or area specific. At that time, Middle East Africa had no assigned sync. So Major Nightingale kind of consolidated all the stuff, figure out where the machine gun is in Dahomey and who's the latest sheik in Dubai, whatever, that sort of stuff. It was kind of a low interest, low level program that none of the syncs had an assigned responsibility, but there was obviously a building up interest because of all these things that you're talking about welling up, Beirut and that. But I was generally viewed as the unengaged staff officer in the organization. Everybody else was kind of going bananas every day. I had a more leisurely approach. Well, very soon after the embassy went down, I got this phone call from Jerry King, who was the chief of staff of 2C-840 JCS SOD, the Special Ops Directorate, of which Rod was the J2. And he said, General Vaught asked me to call you to tell you to come up here. Okay, so Nightingale goes up the stairs, knocks on the door. The yeoman Navy guy grabs me and puts me into this little side room, and Colonel King comes in and he gives me Jane's Fighting Planes, this big blue book. And he says, General Vaught, I'd like you to examine this and find out if there are any helicopters that can go over 1,000 miles. That was it. No discussion about contingency, anything else. So I laboriously go through this whole thing all day. And finally, I find it. And what it is that there was an entry in the Jordanian army that King Hussein had tricked out a RH-53 helicopter with fighter tanks on it that could go 1,400 miles. And so that was the only helicopter I could find that was even close to long, 1,000 miles. So I knocked on my little door. The yeoman opens up. I said, I got the answer for Colonel King. Colonel King comes in with General Vaught. And he said, okay, what have you found? And I showed him the RH-53 from King Hussein. And he said, okay, thanks. And they left. And then about 2 minutes later, the yeoman comes in with this long non-disclosure form, and you'll die if you think about it. Made me sign it all, and then said, okay, you're now part of the task force, go to work. And I reported to King, and then he said, okay, you're the deputy J3 and all sorts of anything else we can make you do. And so I went into the spaces, and that was the start. I was like I say in the book, I was the lowest ranking guy. I was the gopher in there. Go for this, go for that. And everything just evolved from there, as I indicate. The good news is, as the gopher, I got to do all sorts of things the specific staff officers were not doing. I went from here to there, back to there, around here, go see this guy, go get that guy, go write about this. And, I was at all the briefings. So it was, just incredibly insightful for a major who had zero capability in this area, but was engaged.
That's makes a lot of sense. A lot of experiences that you end up having. Of course, you relate a lot of them in the book, but as you started planning, as you became part of that task force, planning a rescue operation, what did you see as those initial challenges for this rescue mission, many, many thousands of miles away in a hostile territory?
It was all challenges. Within, I think, maybe 2 days, Colonel King called us in, who that we had there. And he said, well, let's talk about what the problem is. And, so I was, again, as the gopher in charge of the flip chart, I took out my little pen and I said, rescue the hostages in the embassy. I mean, that was it. And then everybody started putting in what the issues were. Well, no country would allow us to launch from their ground. We didn't have a assured means of getting into the embassy and getting back. We didn't know where the hostages were. We didn't really know which forces would be required to get into the embassy and get them back. I mean, was it going to be just Charlie? We knew he was the core unit, but he's not going to walk in there. So do we jump him in? Do we take him in by train, plane, automobile, truck? Literally, we studied every option to insert Charlie. We had a constant running gun battle with state, who didn't want to tell us very much about either the hostages themselves or about the configuration of the compound. We knew it was 27 acres, but we had 3 separate facilities within that. Was everywhere we looked, there was a major issue, and it was undecided. We didn't know where we were going to launch from, didn't know what we were going to launch, didn't know how we would recover, didn't know how we'd cover the embassy, didn't really have a whole lot of really good intelligence. That was what drove Rod the entire time, if he's on the phone call here. We just had a huge amount of issues. We didn't have any resolutions or answers. We had to work all of those through bit by bit, and as intelligence was developed by Rod and his guys, that changed the operational nature. We went from, we are totally clueless as to how we're going to get there, to, hey, it's got to be a combination fixed wing and then rotary wing. Well, then, we get a lot of experts come in and say, well, you ought to use Chinooks or you ought to use Hueys. Well, Huey is ridiculous. I mean, it's got like maybe 100 miles of range. We had to go over 800. And a Chinook looks like a Chinook. And, where are you going to launch from? Because Turkey won't let us launch from it. Saudi Arabia won't let us launch. Pakistan won't let us launch. So, you have to work within what is doable. And, when we first started, there was nothing doable and it was all unknown. It was just a big black hole. That's a long answer.
Okay, actually, Colonel Rod Lanahan, if you're out there and want to briefly address some of the intelligence challenges you saw at the beginning.
Stephen, I don't believe he was able to join us tonight.
Okay, then we'll we'll skip that part then. Okay.
In his absence, if I could interject, intelligence was always the key issue. The problem we had to deal with is that the only intelligence, if it existed, was really extant with the CIA. And unbeknownst to us initially during this period of time, Stansfield Turner, who came in with Carter as the director, had essentially eviscerated all of the human capabilities, the little old ladies who, worked behind the scenes and actually cooked the food in the embassy, got rid of all those. And they put all of their money into high-tech overhead for a variety of reasons. It was, sexy, it sold well to Congress, and it was a new advent, if you would, in the intelligence community. The problem was we knew everything about what was going on the roof of the embassy. We knew nothing about what was going on underneath the roof of the embassy. And this was continuous. The agents, we had 3 liaisons from the agency with us almost from day one. And they always soft pedaled what they were producing. They tell us, yeah, we're getting this, we're developing it, we're doing this, but they never come back with a definitive answer. And Rod had this great big sign on his desk, which was, where are the hostages? And nobody could answer the question. And this drove everything through execution. We had to assume a worst case clearing 27 acres of that compound, 3 separate facilities, less than 30 minutes on the ground before we were being extracted, required a maximum delta force and a maximum helo lift force. Had we known what we did later, subsequent in the hostage debrief, they were all together and under very sketchy guard, we could have cut the force in half, both troops and helos, and pulled the thing off. As a result, the lack of intel was what, in my mind, was one of the major causes in how the outcome came about.
Well, intelligence is one of those critical requirements for doing any sort of thing, especially at such a distance so far behind enemy lines. Now, as preparation and planning continued, Keith, training areas were required. Of course, you had to look at, the different units involved, kind of understood their task to breach the wall, to clear the embassy, those things they could do at a home station initially. But as you started bringing in the rest of the rescue forces, the helicopters, the airplanes, all those different moving parts, you needed some pretty expansive area to do that in. Can you describe what you were involved in trying to find some of those areas out there to practice and rehearse the operation?
Well, it was very much a joint effort between the 1st Special Operations Wing, the helicopter elements, and the command control structure. The key thing, which was from day one, was we had to replicate the distances and the flight times, and then the altitude and the temperatures. so much as possible. Those all had an effect on your flight profiles. As a result, that immediately meant, well, we're going to have to go out to the western United States. You know, they've got the desert, they've got the altitude, et cetera. So back in 2C840, they developed, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Please leave a message after the tone.
I'm sorry. My apologies. We selected, and we being basically Colonel Pittman, who was the Marine 06 aviation chief, and Colonel Kyle, who was the special operations senior for Vought, would look at the huge map of the western United States and pick locations. You know, we need 800 miles from here to here. Well, where does it go? They'd stick a string out and they'd make some selections for, you know, kind of grossly where would we go. Pittman and I then flew out to Yuma, Arizona, specifically to MCAS Yuma and to Yuma Proving Ground. And we used that as our base. Pittman would figure out which location contiguous to Yuma would be used for a given night's operation. And we would go out there either by vehicle, or I would fly out there in this aircraft, the A1E, that Yuma Proving Ground provided me, select it, see if it worked, it was viable. Then if it was viable, Pittman and I would go out there to find the senior military guy that was close by, like Sierra Army Depot or Fallon Naval Air Station. Show him a letter signed by the chairman that said, help these guys as much as possible. You know, they don't have a budget, but believe me, this is important to the national interest. And, you know, they give us the handshake, and then we'd say, okay, we're going to be here tonight. We don't want anybody awake on this base between 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning. Do you understand? Roger that. We do the operation, bam, back to MCAS Yuma. OPSEC was a huge issue. The key was being able to avoid the overhead coverage of the Soviet satellites. The Soviets were viewed by the chairman, as he enunciated to me, our greatest problem. If the Sovs knew that we were doing something, they would undoubtedly tell the Iranians, and the whole thing would be cooked. The OPSEC issue was a harness on everything that we did. Everybody had to be under a hangar at first light. We were not allowed to have normal interstaff communications in the Joint Staff or anywhere else. If we needed something, and we would have to write it down and give it to usually Major General Dyke, who was in the Ops Directorate, or we would ask for a specific staff officer. We know Captain Schmuck knows about the weather in Eastern Turkey, and then they would bring in Captain Schmuck, swear him to secrecy, and you know, he would tell us about the weather. But my point was, to answer your question, we selected locations throughout the West and the southeastern United States based on geography and climate at that given point. We would exercise the appropriate elements over those profiles and then get them back home before light showed. It was a very complex orchestration throughout the entire period.
Okay, and one of those other things that you were responsible for was the occasional mission essential equipment. Things like night vision goggles, you know, we take almost for granted today. Relatively short supply there. Can you relate that story about getting that mission essential equipment for some of the units?
Well, there were two key items of equipment that we needed that we really didn't have. One was secure satellite communications because of the distances we knew we were going to have to play with. And the other was night vision goggles. Well, in both cases, those were brand new, cutting edge Science magazine kind of articles. They weren't really part of the inventory. The PVS-5, the first family of night vision goggles being manufactured, were just being manufactured. There was a couple of them in Delta, but they were essentially viewed as experimental. And then, of course, our pilots needed them, both fixed wing and rotary wing. And our J4 found 100 plus brand new NVGs at Sacramento Army Depot that were in transit to some testing location. Well, he got myself, Pittman, and literally the little old lady in the depot on the phone. This is at night, like maybe, well, not late afternoon, like 3 o'clock. And he explained to her, this is important. You're going to have to trust us. If you can call this number to Pentagon, they'll verify whom I am. But I really need those NVGs as fast as you can give them to me in any way. She said, well, I really don't have the authority to give them to you. And he said, I understand that, but we really need them. And one of the most moving things to me is I was at the Yuma airport, and the following evening, I got 100 NVGs, 100% of everything that she had. She had boxed up on her own and shipped them down to us at Yuma. And those went to Delta and the pilots, and, you know, sort of the rest is history. That was, you know, square one. We got every NVG that came off the assembly line. On the satellite stuff, it was even more difficult. The SATCOM TACSAT was a brand new thing. Delta had a couple from experimental. They were made by Motorola. General Vought sent his specialized commo guy to the Motorola plant with a phone call assisted by Ross Perot, so we got it at the right level. Our guy showed up and he said, I'll buy every single SATCOM you can get off the assembly line immediately. And the president took him to the SATCOM assembly line, which was essentially 6 guys on a bench, and they were all putting together. And he said, you can give me all the money in the world, but you're not going to get anything faster than these 6 guys can produce it. And that was always a problem for us. You'll note that we did not have secure SATCOM between the 8 launch helicopters. We were working on a naval secure system, and because of that, we were on listening silence. And so we did not have a 100% capability between the fixed wing and the rotary wing. So the fixed wing could not brief the rotary wing on the dust cloud and, you know, all of the above. So that sort of thing, the TACSATs and the NVGs were a major problem for us, and we got everything we could, but it really wasn't, you know, sufficient for what we see today, certainly.
Okay, one thing you alluded to before, and just for general information, some folks are probably aware of this, others may not. You know, when you talked about that letter from the chairman, you know, please help the bearer of this note do whatever he wants, you know, due to national security things we can't talk about. Yeah, that's because this was really an ad hoc rescue effort, you know, run by the chairman, you know, executed by General Vought. Kind of a bunch of teams. In some cases, you had Colonel Beckwith's team, you had the First South folks, you know, but a lot of other folks are kind of brought in. not as a unified standing team, but as a bunch of single players. One of those bunches of single players was were the helicopter pilots, the Navy helicopter pilots that came with the aircraft. They turned out not to work out as well flying over the desert as flying over the ocean. Can you briefly address that? And then I think right after that, Keith, we've got a couple of questions that Abby will jump in on. But if you can talk about
the helicopter issue, it was once we got through the various other options, we weren't going to jump into the embassy. We couldn't do a truck infill. There was no other really ground way to do it. It had to be helos. Because of the restriction from local neighbors, we knew it had to be a shipboard launch. And with the RH-53, with their tanks that they actually had already used for their minesweep op, the helicopter unit off of the Nimitz was the ideal launch organization to carry the force. So they were pulled off initially and sent to Yuma, where they came intact as the helicopter unit, where Pittman met them, and we put them up in a secured area on Yuma Proving Ground and gave them the flight profiles. Well, the flight squadron commander and Pittman had this long conversation. The squadron commander, you could tell, was not comfortable with doing this. They were going to have to be at night, camping in the desert, low level, long penetration. And we started out a couple of days of that, and Pittman did the best he could. He tried to get him in a little bit. We're going to do 2 hours tonight, then we're going to do 4 hours, then we're going to go camping. Well, it became very clear very quickly. The Navy crews did not like this, didn't want to do it, particularly the enlisted. And, one of the things that we discovered is the enlisted had almost as much power as the officers when it comes to organizations. And they became quite ill-disciplined, I use that term. They didn't want to reverse cycle. They wanted to go downtown to Yuma in the evening, and they certainly didn't want to camp in the desert. We had one kind of make or break training session at night, and the helos basically completely deep sixed it. And at that point, Pittman took me and we went over to MCAS Yuma, where we went to a friend of his,
Marine Corps Air Station.
Marine Corps Air Station, Yuma, and went to his buddy, Jim Schaefer, who was there. And Pittman got on the phone to Lieutenant General Shuttler and said, these guys can't hack it. We've got to come up with a plan B. Shuttler got Vaught on the phone. The chairman he wasn't on the phone, but he was obviously engaged. And so the decision was made like within an hour. We're going to fire the Navy guys, and we're going to create a auxiliary force, which would be Marines basically, because Marines flew the 53 also. And then the rest of the evening was Pittman with Schaefer on the phone with their Bupers personnel, finding every available 53 pilot they could. They came up with Jim Seaford, who was just landing in Okinawa to take command of the squadron there, pulled him off and put him on a plane back here. Over the course of the next 48 hours, the pilots began to assemble. Pittman and I went to MCAS Tustin, the Marine Air Station there, and basically he arranged for the helos that were there, 10, to be flown to Yuma they were going to be now the mission training birds, and MCAS Yuma was going to become the base of operations. We did retain one Navy pilot who made a point of asking Pittman to stay, and there was an Air Force guy that had done CSAR work that also was brought in by the SOW, and he joined. You know, there's this impression that, well, all the four services had to have a piece of the puzzle. I can guarantee you everybody that played came by osmosis. It wasn't any parochial directive, well, we got to have a Marine do this or an Army guy do that. It was just by chance, circumstance, and opportunity.
Okay, Abby, I think we'll go to a question now from the participants.
Okay, wonderful. Colonel Nightingale, I have two questions for you. I'll start off with the first. The question is, what takeaways from your experience in blue light transferred over to be applied to the key formation structure, operational means, and methods to Delta Force?
I restate that again. I'm not quite sure I understood the question about form and structure.
Sure. So we received, what takeaways from your experience in blue light transferred over to be applied to the key formation structure and operational means and methods to Delta Force?
Okay, the key thing is joint interoperability is absolutely essential. Nothing Delta did was essentially by itself then or in the future. We had the Army helicopters, the little birds. We had them all in the back of the Special Operations Wing. We had special support from NSA. Delta was the core operational structure, and they were the door knockers and the guy that were the ultimate pointy end of the bayonet. But it took a whole package to get together to do that effectively. Initially, Charlie was resistive to that. He didn't want to call them all rubberneckers. He didn't want any rubberneckers around. But it became clear that you had to have all these people to have a real team. And I think that was my big takeaway, is that anything we were doing in the future was going to have different services and different operational components to it.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you for answering that. I will go on to question number 2, which is, what special ops conventional wisdom was rejected or modified to make Delta Force better meet the mission vision for the Delta Force?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I go back really to my first response. Initially, Charlie wanted Delta to be a standalone, act-alone force. That was very clearly not the answer. You know, that's why the Rangers got involved, because Charlie just didn't have enough people. You've got to have a capability to do all things. As you do an operational scenario, different things come out. You need different capabilities. We need to go here, we need to go there, we got to fly there, we got to go on the ground here, we need to open the door this way, we need to fly 800 miles from this location. It takes a mix of all of the service capabilities to put that pointy end of the bayonet at the right door. And you know, we had to recognize that in time and work toward it to where we are now. I mean, that's why we have JSOC and SOCOM.
Wonderful. I'm sorry, Stephen.
Any other questions at this point?
We have a couple hand raised. I did chat those people that have their hand raised, but I'm not seeing anything come through just yet.
I'm
Okay,
game
well,
for anything if they have audio.
Yes. So William Walter said that there were 7 Navy crewmen and 1 Air Force.
Yeah, he's speaking of the helicopter crews.
Perfect. He said correct.
a clarifying comment, thanks.
By the way, Bill was
All
a
right.
crewman in the SOW during the operation.
Wonderful.
And Abby, you have another question or a comment?
I'm not seeing any so far.
Okay,
One
well,
just
let me
came-
just,
Oh, you're good to go.
okay, I was just gonna say, you know, as I think probably everybody here knows, the rescue mission did launch. You know, the aircraft departed the Nimitz en route to what became later known, became world famously known as Desert One. The fixed wing aircraft with the assaulters, both from Colonel Beckwith's unit as well as Special Forces Detachment Berlin, arrived. The helicopters arrived late. They all did not arrive, and when they arrived, there were not the required 6 operational helicopters to execute the mission. The decision was made because the threshold had not been achieved to abort and try again in the future. As the helicopters, as everybody's preparing to depart, one of the helicopters crashed into one of the EC-130 fixed wing aircraft with a loss of 8 lives. And then the force ended up just pulling back from there, leaving the wreckage of the helicopters, or the undamaged helicopters in some cases, and flew back. So the world became aware of what happened on this operation later on. We're going to run out of time shortly, and you have to read the book to find out a little bit more about it. But Keith, any thoughts on the end of the rescue mission? You were in the joint operations area there with the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and some of the other seniors. Can you describe the reactions, when the mission was aborted and the news of the crash came over?
We had a Major Deke, who was our signal guy, had established a flash precedent phone system between General Vaught at Wadi Kina, the Pentagon, and the White House. And General Vaught, of course, was monitoring Colonel Kyle, who was the on-scene commander at Desert One, and relaying the issues as they came about. To make sure we understand, when the helicopter landed, when it only had 5 operational birds, the decision at that point was to abort the mission and go back the following night, which was in fact part of the plan. Rod Lenahan had already worked out what plan B was going to be, and we were going to go back to the Nimitz and do it again the next night. But the fuel didn't work, so they had to go back and refuel, which created the issue and the crash. Anyway, you know, the beginning was an abort to go back, and then it became an abort, period. On the mission, Vaught had relayed to the chairman, monitored by the White House, the decision to abort and go back, approved by White House, and then the accident occurred, and it was an accident. Vaught did not have clear information as to what occurred, only there'd been a major accident, and Kyle had reported that they were aborting everything and evacuating immediately. And there was this deathly silence on the line between, I was in this small 2 C-840 spaces with Brown and Jones. And
So Air Force General Jones and Secretary Brown.
Jones, the chairman, Secretary of Defense Brown, and our acting chief back there, Rod Pascal, a couple other people, Maynard Wires, the J3. And the planes crashed. There was the abort. It was basically a disaster unfolding. Of course, all information is bad and it's all wrong at the beginning. And so there was just this huge pall. And Brown, who was very circumspect, got up and he said, "Shit, my God, shit," and walked out the door. I mean, his head was down. It was, horrible. And the chairman was, trying to maintain calm on the whole situation. And, the White House was calm too. It was just, tell me what you know when you know it. And that was it. But the one thing that sticks in my mind is Brown, who's this nuclear physicist, was always speaking in ethereal terms. He just got up and he said, "Shit, oh shit," walked out the door. So I'm sorry if there's any sensitivities out there with the audience, but that is in fact what occurred.
Okay, well, we are approaching the witching hour here. As I think everybody knows, the second rescue mission did not happen. There was no need for it. The hostages were released on Inauguration Day, 1981. However, the work by then Major Nightingale and others continued on, and with more funding and more support, the Special Forces and Special Operations capability of the United States military began to really expand. And you can read more about it in the book, as he talks about some of the other successes later on in that decade with Panama and going on into operations this century. So that groundwork laid by men like Colonel Nightingale and others were really substantial in that. One thing I'd like to point out, there are some other first-person accounts that have been written about this operation that may also be worth checking out if you haven't done so already. Colonel Beckwith wrote Delta Force. Jim Kyle, the Air Force component commander, mentioned by Colonel Nightingale, wrote The Gust to Try. General Boykin, the member of Colonel Beckwith's unit, wrote Never Surrender. And John Carney, an Air Force special operator, wrote No Room for Error. And one other book by Jim Lenahan was Crippled Eagle, also another account kind of the essentially buildup of SOF post-Vietnam into what we've got today. So, Colonel Nightingale, any final thoughts before we take off? We know you have some other operations going on today.
A couple of points. The post operation you mentioned was called Project Honey Badger. Project Honey Badger essentially became what Special Operations Forces are today. This was a formal organization that actually had a budget, and it brought in all of the developing forces and capabilities that we were missing during the Desert One portion. The Task Force 160 birds, the Rangers with their airfield seizure capability, proliferation of night vision goggles and secure communications, the upgrading of the first Special Operations Wing, the creation of what we now call the ISA, the Army Intelligence Structure Support Organization, and a number of other things, all came about because of the disaster. I'm convinced, had it succeeded, that what that was developed would have failed and never have occurred. The senior leadership, Les Myers, their absolute pessimism, negativism towards special ops was palpable. Later on, as the Joint Action Officer, I had to go around to the very senior service guys, and you could tell they just hated this. They wanted nothing to do with it. It was a diversion of resources, a diversion of people. It was going to be a disaster for their respective service if they got involved with this stuff. It wasn't until later in the force of events that special operations became an honored portion of the service's toolkits. Up to that point, I guarantee you the service chiefs, again, Les Meyer, would have killed it if they could. Meyer's successor, General Wickham, tried to kill it. He wanted to convert the Rangers back to pure vanilla, disband Task Force 160 and get rid of ISA. And Jack Marsh, who was both the Secretary of the Army and acting ASD Solek, took a 24-hour break, started doing his own investigation, and discovered where all these forces were and what they were doing and what the operational things were that were going on. And he told Wickham, hell no. In fact, I direct you to reinforce them and resource them, and I want to see it on the table. And, that saved them. If it had not been for Marsh, we would have, I'm not sure we would have been able to get UBL and some of the wonderful things that we see today. So, in the beginning, it wasn't easy, but that's always the way it is.
Keith, I know you have a
that
future
concludes my
engagement here.
soliloquy.
Yeah, no problem. I know you have a future engagement. We did get a couple more questions. If you think you can take one or two of them.
Go ahead. I'll talk
Abby?
as long as I can.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So we have one that says, after the aircraft disasters, the mission was called off by the Navy. Should the mission have proceeded, and why?
No, the mission was not called off by the Navy. The mission decision was to abort and go back in the following day. Now, to answer the other part of the question is, had we known all of the hostages were on the ground floor of the Chancellery building and loosely guarded before we actually did the launch in country, Charlie could have had a plan B. We could have gone in there with a smaller Delta force and a smaller Hilo force. In other words, sufficient lift with 5 to do the mission. But we didn't know that because we didn't know the intel of where the hostages were.
Okay, Abby, another question?
Great, yes. So someone says, hi, Colonel Nightingale. My name is Captain Pearson, an active duty civil affairs officer. He's stationed at the Master of Business program in the University of North Carolina, specializing in corporate strategy. My question is a pretty open-ended question, since I really appreciated your outlook from the major perspective throughout your book, given the massive complexity of the situation you faced. So do you have any advice, sir, for young field grades and how they can best prepare themselves to serve on Special Operation Forces staff to contribute to the strategic or at the very least operational fight?
Common sense and intelligence. There's not a whole lot you can do to train for this sort of thing. I was certainly not trained. I made a lot of mistakes, but that's life experience. You just have to be very open. Never go into something with a prejudice. Everybody has a viewpoint, and some of them are reasonably decent. You have to be able to accept all of that, analyze it, and do what you're told. The key thing that I found were problems were personalities becoming abrasive or particularly kind of pushy of an agenda that no longer had qualitative value to it. So you just have to look, you have to have an open, what I'm saying is have an open mind, use your basic gut instincts, and try to be as helpful as possible. Being helpful as possible is really important. You really don't appreciate the pressures that the senior people have to deal with until you're in a situation like that. And they're all human beings. They're really no particularly better trained or prepared than anybody else is for the job. They just get it because of time and circumstance. Your job is to help them out as best you can.
Wonderful.
Steve, thanks.
Yep, I believe that's all we have so far.
Okay, well, I think one thing I also did want to mention is, for those of you who are familiar, and this may be some of the folks with grayer hair, uh, probably back during the late 80s, 90s, there was a Army Colonel Dandridge Mike Malone, did a lot of writing about soldiers and leadership. Uh, I think Colonel Nightingale has kind of picked up the mantle on that. If you want to look sometime at Small Wars Journal, there's a variety of essays that he's written on those kind of topics, and kind of speaking grunt, does a great job if you're really interested in that. He's also got 2 other books out, Just Another Day in Vietnam and A Soldier Looks Back, Memories and Recollections. So there's a couple of things out there, especially if you find you really enjoy Phoenix Rising, you can go back to the source for some other experiences that
Amazon
you can.
reviews. Give me Amazon reviews.
Okay, well, I think absent any other questions, I think Colonel Nightingale did a great job in kind of wrapping up there. We didn't really get into all the variety of topic areas, but I think that the benefit of having him here today kind of highlighted other parts of the book that you'll be able to look at and learn about. This is a very important part of American military history, this time frame in the early 80s as our special operations capability, the one that we have today, as he mentioned earlier, really started developing. And he was one of the key guys to help it. Of course, there are a lot of others involved too. But Keith, I think I'll end here. I'd like to say thanks to you, especially for your time today, and the Airborne and Special Operations Museum Foundation and museum itself for sponsoring this event. Despite being not all together at one time in one place, this was a great way to accomplish that mission in the time we had available. So
Happy to
that's it from
serve.
me, Keith. Say again?
Happy to serve.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all. I can't see anybody, but I'll turn you back over to Abby, I think, as we close out. Thank you so very much for your participation today. And I know the museum will let us know next time we have one of these things. Take care.
Yes. Yes.
My
Thank you,
pleasure.
everyone, for joining. And any questions that we didn't get to or missed or anything like that, we will follow up via email. So don't worry about that. But thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. All right. Ending the webinar now.
Is it just us, folks?